Back in the days before we all had the internet and could just watch trailers and gameplay previews in the months prior to a game's release, we generally had to make do with just the odd screenshot in a magazine. Sometimes a TV show such as Bad Influence or Games Master would give us a bit of a sneaky peek at a game early, but often we wouldn't see it moving until it was plugged into our consoles, outside of the odd advert on TV that is, if the game got adverts. Because of this, any chance to play a game demo was not to be passed up. In the days of cartridge gaming, this was almost non-existent on consoles, likely due to the expense of producing cards. If you were lucky, you may find a kiosk in a store running an import copy of a game, but that was very rare indeed. On home computers though, demos were a pretty common thing. Some of my earliest gaming memories are of playing the York Sinclair magazine demo tapes, trying out single levels of games due out around the issue's release. Similarly, I'd play the demo disc featured on Amiga format magazines when I moved on to an A500. But then, in 1995, this all began to change. The Sega Saturn and PlayStation 1 were here, and the cheap to produce CDs they used allowed demo discs to become the number one way we got to see games in motion before release. While the Saturn did have its share of demo discs, the PlayStation was the king of this format. For many, they'd be the first thing you'd experience on the console, as almost every PS1 was sold with a pack-in demo disc in the early days. This would be featured on the cover of magazines too, which over the years became more important to many of us teens than the magazines they were attached to. On today's Mellow Gaming Recommends, I'm not looking at one game, I'm looking at a number of games, along with all the contents of the very first UK PlayStation 1 demo disc. Today we're looking at the Demo 1 disc as found in launch UK PlayStation consoles when they first hit the shores in September of 1995, which I had to search for on eBay and find the exact one with the correct serial code both on the disc and the sleeve to make sure I had the right one. Also, I discovered about 20 minutes before writing this sentence that the registry form was still in here. This is going to be a nostalgic one for sure. For this episode I'll be looking at the 4 areas of the disc content, those being games, VCD, previews and tech. Obviously games is the gameplay demos themselves. Hopefully you won't mind me saving them for last. I will be putting timecodes on this episode if you wish to skip ahead. VCD is the music visualizer, tech is the interactive tech demos, and previews are the trailers, and is that last section that we'll be starting with. This preview section contains a number of trailers for some of the PlayStation's earliest releases in the form of some very compressed video footage. Even by PS1 video standards, these are pretty messy looking. The first thing you'll notice is that I'm using the term trailers a little loosely here. These are more like a series of clips set to some music, possibly from the games themselves. First up is Tekken, a game released here in the UK a few weeks after the PlayStation 1's launch. This is a game I had bundled with my PlayStation, as are a few featured on this disc. Everyone knows Tekken now, but at the time this was the rough and ready upstart coming for Virtua Fighter's crown as king of the polygonal 3D beat-em-ups. It made quite an impression at the time, and I was pretty addicted to it myself. It was just edgier and more real looking than Virtua Fighter was. And remember, this was the mid-90s, so everyone was a little edgelord at this time. Something I hope many have grown out of, although Tekken is still rad. This trailer is just unedited footage of a match between King and Yoshimitsu that falls short of being a minute long. In fact, I've probably talked about it longer here than it plays for, so I've likely started looping it already. I suspect I'll be doing that a few times. Next up is Warhawk, which released in December 1995 here. This was a flight combat game that was generally pretty striking and impressive at the time. I still think it has some really nice looking moments. The game was developed by Single Track, who followers of the show will remember also developed the early Twisted Metal games, which I covered in the last MG Recommends episode. Unfortunately, Warhawk never really became that huge of a hit, or at least it didn't really resonate with early PlayStation gamers in the same way as some of the early releases did. It's probably mostly well known for being rebooted for the PlayStation 3 as an online multiplayer game that they sure did hype up a lot, only for people to be barely kinda into. Speaking of Twisted Metal, here's Twisted Metal. As I believe I mentioned in the Twisted Metal 2 video, this first game reached the UK in January of 1996, nearly 4 months after the console's launch here. This trailer is actually pretty neat as it shows a decent variety of clips, and also reminds me that there was a cool first person mode in the game that I'd entirely forgotten about. Look at them character specific hands, that's a neat touch. Also check out how the text on the character select screen is entirely different from how it appears in the final game. Did you know I like Twisted Metal? I may have mentioned it. Next up is Rapid Reload, also known as Gunner's Heaven in Japan. This was actually a launch title for the PS1 in the UK, and never got a release in the US due to an apparent policy against the release of 2D games by Sony Computer Entertainment America, which I call bollocks on, because the PlayStation 1 released in the US with Rayman, Street Fighter the movie and the Raiden project. That's 3 2D games on the US release a mere 3 weeks before the UK release. Regardless, there was a bias against 2D games at the time that I do remember when it came to certain magazines. I even remember Symphony of Night being criticised for not being 3D. Due to Rapid Reload's scarcity outside Japan, the PAL copies now command prices that can reach over £200. The Japanese Gunner's Heaven is generally half the price. I feel this is a game that could really do with a digital re-release, as it is considered a pretty darn solid shooter, even if it's clearly quite similar to Gunstar Heroes. Now we have Ridge Racer. Note to Futuramp, put that Ridge Racer clip in here. As you'll no doubt know, this legendary game was a launch title everywhere, including the UK. This was very much the game you had to own. Even now I think it's a superb show of just how good a PlayStation 1 port of an arcade game could be. Much like the Tekken video, this is an unedited clip of one lap of the game's famous first track. Really, it's all the game needed to make George drop at the time. Cannot overstate just how big a deal Ridge Racer was to selling PlayStations at launch. There's not really much else to say, we all know this game. So, moving on. Here's Jumping Flash, another UK launch title, and one we actually got before the US, which was a super rare thing at the time. Well, if you ignore that we got Rapid Reload and they didn't at all. Jumping Flash is notable for being one of the earliest 3D platformers, a first person one at that. There was a period where it seemed a few teams were trying to figure out 3D platforming during the mid-90s, and there's no doubt Jumping Flash got a fair few things right. It utilised wide open spaces, perfect for giving you a little trial and error for this new dimension of jumping about. The shadow to help guide you when landing was also a very good touch, one a few early 3D platformers didn't think of using. Ultimately, Super Mario 64 became the flag bearer for the new genre, but I still think it's worth noting Jumping Flash's influence. Lastly, for this preview section, we have Starblade Alpha, which released in February 1996 in the UK. Starblade Alpha is a remake of the 1991 arcade game Starblade, an on-rail shooter that had a few console ports in the early days of CD-based gaming. The remake featured new textured graphics, but was developed without the involvement of the original arcade version's team. Personally, I actually prefer the original flat shaded look, but I'm sure this appeared more impressive to early PlayStation adopters. And that's it for the preview trailers. We'll now take a short diversion into the VCD and tech sections of the disc before we get into the games themselves. Next up, we'll explore a portion of the disc intended to show off some of the technical skills of the PlayStation. First up is VCD, which isn't anything to do with the mostly forgotten film format of the day, and is in fact a music visualizer, one that seems a little bit more hyperactive than I remember. Here's a snippet of some calming music from Final Fantasy X. And now, the way more intense Otherworld from the same game. Note how they both react in the same kinetic way. This could easily be down to me using a PlayStation 3 to capture this footage though, as I'm sure that could potentially affect the way it works. Regardless, music visualizers were a pretty standard inclusion for CD-based consoles and devices at the time. I remember I used to use the one that was built into many PlayStation 1 models as a little background light and music show while reading magazines and comics. More often than not, the world's #1 sci-fi album, because I was such a cool teen. The next two tech demos are a bit more interactive and show off some higher detail character models, which were likely pushing the console a little at the time. First we have the Manta, a calming visual of, Manta swimming around a bit. You can rotate the camera around and zoom in and out. You can also make the fish swim away and return. Admittedly, not the most exciting demo in the world. Still, it's a nice looking manta ray and a pretty chill demo. What comes next is anything but chill though. This is the tech demo I imagine most people remember, the T-Rex. I still think this is impressive today. The modelling is really good for the limitations of the system, and the animation is fantastic stuff. You can move the camera about as you could with the Manta Ray demo, but on top of that you can move the dino's head left to right and make him snarl and roar. You can even combine the snarl and roar actions to make them look a little meaner. You may also remember this guy from appearing in the recent PlayStation 5 packing game. If you got to the end, that is. The plain black background and foreboding music really give this one a nice dark and atmospheric mood. Interestingly, the demo featured a castle in the background on the Japanese demo discs, no idea why. What I really need to know is why we didn't get the Shuffling Muscle Men demo though. Anyway, moving on. Okay, now we're on to the real meat and potatoes of this demo disc, the playable demos. We'll start with the one that's the least interesting though, because, well, it's sports, and it's also barely a playable demo. This is Total NBA 96, aka NBA Shootout in the US, and all you can do in this demo is choose a few camera angles. One of them lets you move the camera about a little bit, but that's it. The simplicity of this demo is likely due to how far ahead of the game's release this was. Total NBA 96 didn't hit UK shores until March 1996, a full 6 months after this demo disc was released. There was a later playable demo on the VIP demo disc that was notable for having 2 children as hidden characters, but only on the European version of the demo. Shout out to Koble on YouTube for this footage. Next is Loaded, a game released in the US in December 1995 and in the UK in February 96. This game was kind of a big deal for an early PS1 game, mostly for being part of the whole dark, edgy and violent trends that were becoming popular at the time. It even had characters designed by Garth Ennis of Preacher fame and Greg Staples, who is most known for his 2000 AD work. The game is a solid top-down shooter that I find takes a second to get used to, as my brain instinctively reaches for the twin sticks when it sees this view and characters holding big guns. At the time though, we didn't really have much like this on consoles, save for Robotron and Smash TV, so I imagine it wasn't so tricky at the time. There's something about playing early 3D console games that can be a bit jarring today when you've grown used to modernised, smoother control schemes. Going back to the mid-90s and experiencing games at a time when no one had really figured this sort of thing out can feel weird. I usually find I adjust after a few minutes, but I imagine it's entirely alien to younger gamers. Anyway, this Loaded demo is some good fun, even if you can only play as Baby. I want to be flanked, damn it. #cheekyflank. Now let's talk about Battle Arena Toshinden. This was a launch title in the UK and was hyped up a lot as the new Virtua Fighter beater, even though Tekken was also being called that. To be fair, it was a pretty decent fighter at the time and is a true 3D fighting game, as you can step in and out of the screen. Also, its weapons-based combat beat Namco's Soul Edge to the post by just a few months. These days I do find the game quite clunky and awkward, but it's not as bad as some other early 3D fighters. The demo allows you to pick from 3 characters in the forms of Aichi, Ellis and Foe, and I'm equally awful with all of them. One interesting aspect of this demo is that it features the Japanese version of the soundtrack, rather than the one made for Western audiences. Digital Foundry recently discussed this in their US PlayStation launch games videos, so shout out for them for putting that fresh nugget of knowledge in my brain in time for scripting this video. The last 2 games we'll look at were both pushed pretty hard in the UK, as they were both published by Liverpool's own Psygnosis Studios, who had recently been purchased by Sony. First we have Destruction Derby. The game was developed by Reflections Interactive, who'd go on to make the Driver series. It was released in October 1995 and was one of the first PlayStation games I owned, as it came with my console. This demo features the titular Destruction Derby mode, where you drive around in a circular arena scoring points by spinning and destroying the opposing cars. There's only so many tactics you can use here because, by the nature of a Destruction Derby, you are going to be smashing yourself as much as you're smashing other cars. It's a fun old time though, and was a bit of a nostalgic experience to play in this demo. When you finish, you get a replay of your attempt to survive cut together with text promoting the game's release. Kind of like it's creating a trailer for the game out of your gameplay. Pretty neat, and no, I have no idea what that garbled stuff is at the side. And lastly we have Wipeout, one of the biggest names in the early days of the PlayStation 1's life here in the UK. A lot of the UK launch was built around this, and it was indeed a launch title here, coming to the US in November 1995. The game tapped into the UK clubbing scene hard with its techno-themed soundtrack from Cold Storage, aka Tim White, who was known for crafting music for many of Psygnosis' games at the time, and was the mind behind the Music series. This demo features one track and one futuristic floaty car, and really that's all it needed. I've never really been sure on how this game was perceived around the world, but here in the UK this was the coolest game on the market and defined what the PlayStation 1 was here. Hell, they'd put PS1s in nightclubs with this game in them. The soundtrack had a CD release here which was practically unheard of at the time. The demo is just as unforgiving as thrilling as I remember the game being, and, like Destruction Derby, it brought back a lot of memories. This was another game I had packed in with my PS1 in mid-1996 and I played it a lot. I got pretty good at it too, and as you've come to expect from me, I'm kinda terrible at it now. Still, this was the standout demo on the disc and is still a bit of a standout game today. So, that's the first UK PlayStation demo disc. These discs are almost inseparable from the PlayStation 1 experience for me, and I massively regret giving away all the ones I had years ago. To be fair though, I literally had multiple big bags full of them. The experience of getting a new demo disc each month with a PlayStation magazine was one I'd always look forward to. I remember many a weekend playing these with Mellow Gaming Play's co-hosts Paul and Kevin. I know Kev has a special soft spot for the discs which contained Net Your Rose games, homebrew PlayStation games. That may be a subject for another day though. Let me know what you thought of this episode and if you'd like to see more MG Recommends that dive into a specific element of gaming history rather than just focusing on an individual game. If you'd like to see the content of this disc for yourself, I'll be posting the footage minus the VCD section because, you know, content ID, and posting it on the channel soon. There will be a link added to the description when that happens. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of you for watching, and also thank my Patreons who support me every time a new Mellow Gaming Recommends episode goes live. Their names are on the screen now. We're getting quite close to the next Patreon goal, which will result in Patreons picking an indie game to be played on the channel each month, which may end up becoming a Recommends episode of its own if it tickles me just right. We'll also be picking another creator for me to back on Patreon to pass a little something on. Also, shout out to Jimmy Happer of Import Gaming for the win, who gave me the inspiration to do this after watching his recent videos on the early Japanese demo discs. Those videos are quite excellent and I'll link them in the description. So, once again, thank you for watching, do a like and subscribe and whatever other stuff YouTube wants me to tell you to do, as if you are unable to make these choices yourself. I'll catch you next time.